Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the festival director. FODI is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival based in Sydney, Australia, that aims to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. FODI gathers the world's best experts, innovative thinkers and mischief makers to provoke and inspire curious minds. In an age of creeping authoritarianism, anyone who questions the logic of competing narratives when it comes to historical conflicts risks being silenced. Russian-American journalist Masha Gessen says in order to learn from history, we have to question our world and recognise the signs of when we're sliding into darkness. In this session, we examine how the intersection of history, memory, propaganda and censorship enforces the narratives of today, and what happens when narrative becomes dogma. Please enjoy The War of the Narratives, chaired by journalist Hamish MacDonald.
Very good afternoon, everyone. I know it's the name of a very different television show, but thank God you're here.
Thank you.
I don't think Masha Gessen requires much further introduction. You're probably all here because you know their work, and I'm not going to waste time on that because there is so much to talk about. But I do just want to touch on the kerfuffle of the week, which is that you almost didn't get to Australia. The Australian government had your visa application. You had ticked the box saying that you had a criminal conviction, of course, in reference to Russia's sentencing you in absentia. Without going back over old news, 2 days old news, a reflection on what this says about Putin's reach, Putin's ability to influence what we hear here in Australia.
Right. So I'm one of probably 250, 300 people who have been charged under this military law called knowingly spreading false information about the Russian armed forces, which is what in the rest of the world is known as doing journalism. And more than half of us are people who are actually living in exile. So this whole sentencing in absentia, and I've been sentenced to in absentia to 8 years, this whole sentencing people in absentia thing is a way of putting you on notice and a way of constraining you. Right? So the idea mostly, I thought, was to prevent me from going to places where I would be at risk of being detained or even extradited. Right? So you don't want to go to, say, Indonesia, unfortunately, which has a brand new extradition treaty with Russia, and even if they didn't decide to extradite me in the end, I would probably spend the better part of a family vacation in an Indonesian jail. What it didn't occur to me is that it would also create problems for me in places like Australia, where I can't not tick off the box that says that asks whether you've been convicted of any crime anywhere in the world, but and I attach an explanatory note. But the thing worked. Australia didn't issue me a visa until the whole sort of media attention to this issue.
Is there a lesson for countries like Australia in this about being alive to what the hell's going on in the world?
I think I couldn't put it better myself. Yeah.
Well, it is great to have you here.
It's great to be here, and thank you for the visa.
Very warm welcome. You mentioned your conviction, and it related to a very specific interview that you did with a famous Russian blogger, and the sort of substance of it was about what happened in Bucha in Ukraine. Millions of views of that clip, as I understand it now. It was in Russian.
Right.
Can you give us here, we know the version of the story we get about Russia and Ukraine. Could you sort of paint a snapshot of how Russians, ordinary Russians, might be seeing this thing they're not meant to call a war?
Right. So most Russians, and when I say most, I mean probably 95% of people who follow the news in any way, which still leaves out millions and millions of people, right? It's a huge country where we think between 5 and 10% of the population are going to great lengths to consume independent news. And there is a huge operation of Russian journalists working in exile who've done extraordinary work, being able to cover a war where they don't have physical access to either side of the war, right? Most of them can't get into Ukraine because they're Russians, and they can't go back to Russia because they'll get arrested. And yet they managed to put out really high quality content, including on Russian war crimes, which is something that Russian journalists in exile are equipped to report better than anyone else. So, setting that aside, a majority of Russians get a story of a triumphant war that Russia is fighting against NATO, which is also often referred to as the Nazis, and its puppet regime in Ukraine. You might wonder how they can be fighting a triumphant war against a much smaller country for 2.5 years and not have won it, but propaganda bubbles are extraordinarily resilient things.
Can you just tease that out, though? Because if it's not a war, why has it lasted this long?
Right. And if it's victorious,
yeah,
why hasn't the victory arrived yet?
Yeah.
I can't really answer that question.
Okay.
I can just tell you that that somehow that message has landed. And, let me try to answer it in a couple of ways. One is that the longer this war goes on, and so there are two opposing forces at work. One is that the regime has basically promised people that they will be able to continue living their regular lives without disruption, despite this war going on. And that's something that enables you to think about it as a war and yet not a war. Right? Because in the Russian imagination, in a country that still is living the memory of World War II, a war is something that engulfs the entire country and nobody lives anything but the war. So that's how that is able to exist. And on the other hand, there's this opposing force, which is that the longer it goes on and the more people sacrifice and invest in it, the less able they are to try to resist mentally and psychically. The higher the price of questioning the narrative that they're getting on television. Mm-hmm. And so that's a classic kind of totalitarian dichotomy, where you have to be able to think two contradictory things at the same time on parallel tracks in your head, and the adaptive mechanism is never thinking those two things at the same time so that you don't see the contradiction. So that's how it's working, and that's why I think that's how I understand the purpose of the Ukrainian incursion into Russia right now. So I assume a lot of people know that for the last 2 weeks, Ukraine has fought on Russian territory. They were able to pierce Russian defenses, and they've advanced pretty far into Russia. They have created probably hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people. And they claim over 1,000, but definitely several hundred Russian soldiers, prisoners of war, on Russian territory. And I see the purpose of that operation as trying to pierce that propaganda bubble, trying to make Russians feel that they are actually living in wartime.
Because one of the consequences of it is that Putin is starting to request conscripts from the big cities.
Right. From
Moscow, from St. Petersburg.
Exactly.
Does it pierce the bubble?
It may. I mean, that alone is not going to pierce the bubble. I think displaced persons probably make a bigger difference.
Yeah.
Because they're flooding into large cities, into Moscow, into St. Petersburg. They're interacting with their families there. They're telling them about life in the border regions, which has been extremely difficult and dangerous for a while now. And that, I think, may start shaking things up.
From an outside perspective, part of what's happening with these Ukrainian advances into Russian territory is that it looks also like it might be taking out an insurance policy against a Trump victory in the US election. Because if they're then told early next year, day one, you have to sit down and negotiate, let Putin have a bit of land, they've got something to trade. Is that too simplistic a way of...
I don't think it's too simplistic at all. I think that Ukrainians, obviously, with very good reason, have been terrified of a Trump victory. They also feel like if military aid from the United States, which has been insufficient and late for the entire 2.5 years of the war, right? And I want to emphasize this, because we talk a lot about how the Western powers have coalesced around Ukraine, and there's an unprecedented Western consensus that has barely been shaken in the last 2.5 years. And to some extent, that's true.
Because everyone in this room is paying tax money that is going to send stuff to the Ukrainians. Are you saying it's not enough? You want more of our money?
What I'm saying is that, well, I don't know about the tax money. I don't know exactly how it works in Australia. In the United States, most of the money is staying in the United States, right? It's military manufacturing that is being funded by taxpayer money, and the money is staying in the United States, and it's actually benefiting the U.S. economy. Not sure if it's any different.
We don't make quite as much of military hardware as the U.S. does.
Right. But what I want to say is this. NATO and the Western powers have had the military might sufficient to end this war the day it began. And they haven't done it. They have not committed troops, they have not committed planes, they have not closed the skies. And basically what NATO has been saying now for 2.5 years is that as long as only Ukrainians are dying, they're willing to have this war continue. They're funding Ukraine to the extent that is necessary for the war not to spread to EU territory. But they're not funding or supporting the war, the Ukrainian war effort in a way that would be sufficient to actually end this conflict and to stop the deaths and torture and occupation of millions of Ukrainians. And so Ukrainians have been aware that even this aid may very well have an expiration date. And that expiration date may be January 20th, 2025. So, of course, it's not, I wouldn't think of it so much as an insurance policy as they have to use what they have right now because they may no longer have the resources come January.
Can you, because we're here to talk about narratives, it strikes me, having covered part of the Ukraine conflict, having covered the Georgia conflict back in 2008, and trying to conduct interviews with Russian officials at various times, deal with Russian soldiers, there's a greater degree of comfort in doing what you just described, this idea of holding contradictory ideas in your head at one time, even though they both seem to be totally opposite. Is that a historic thing? Is it a cultural thing? What is it that makes it easier for Russia to do that as a nation state, to hold all of these ideas at once?
It's a totalitarianism thing. It's 70 years of Soviet totalitarianism where that was the most important mental trick that the regime played on its people and the most important mental and cultural accommodation that people developed in response to it. And that's what made Putinism so possible and in a way so easy to establish.
Because he understands it? It's sort of inherent?
He feels it in his bones. Yeah.
Okay. Can you give me an example of that? Because I guess for most of us it's hard to imagine. I mean, you know, we all occasionally feel gaslit by a politician, but it seems like Putin does it on a kind of industrial scale.
Well, the propaganda that accompanies the war in Ukraine. It's not a war, it's a special military operation. You can go to jail for calling it a war. It's a heroic effort to fight the Nazis, and our boys are sacrificing their lives to save our country. Right? There's no such thing as Ukraine, and there's no such thing as Ukrainian language. We have to fight on Ukrainian territory and depose the Ukrainian regime because they're forcing Russians to speak Ukrainian. That's
it.
That's it.
When you were working in Russia, you got a phone call one day from Putin, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Tell us about it.
Oh boy. Well, it is my best cocktail party story, but I didn't expect to be asked about it. So very quickly, at the time I had actually mostly left political journalism. I was doing it in English, but not in Russian, and because it was impossible. And the year was 2012, and I was editing a popular science magazine, the oldest and biggest general interest magazine in Russia, and Putin really liked it. And so one day I had a phone call from my publisher asking me to send a reporter with Putin when he was going hang gliding with the Siberian cranes. And I said no. And this was not a brave journalistic stance. This was actually a calculated decision, because I thought if I sent a reporter and the reporter saw something that they reported and we put in the magazine, and I was sure there was going to be something, because again, as a popular science magazine, I'd been following what Putin was doing. He was really into being king of the jungle at the time, so he was doing things with animals all the time, and animals were like drugged and some died, and so I thought something like this is going to happen. We better stay away, because if I put it in the magazine is going to be in trouble. But if we don't see it, no harm, no foul. We're a popular science magazine. So I said no, and then the publisher fired me on the spot. But Putin really liked the magazine, so then he wanted to offer me my job back, which you'd think wasn't his to offer back, but that's not what he thinks. So he asked me to come to the Kremlin to talk to him, and I did, and we had an absolutely ridiculous conversation, in which he talked to me about nature conservation, and I talked to him about media freedom. And we did not come to a mutual understanding.
That sounds like competing narratives.
Right.
Just before we move on, there's now a very stark choice in the United States between two possible presidents. One, just in the last 24 hours, has taken a very strong line in support of Ukraine, NATO, standing up to Putin, standing up to China. The other wants a more sort of isolationist approach. How much, in terms of the Putin-Ukraine world, rests on the decision that America will make later this year?
Everything. Like, everything. And it's absurd and terrifying. And, it also makes you thinking I'm going to get myself in trouble now, but it's such a stark example of how the world depends on the United States, and how millions, hundreds of millions of people have a stake in the outcome of the US election, and yet Americans are so allergic to any suggestion of foreign interference, right? But all these people's lives depend on, and I'm not arguing for foreign interference, but I am arguing that perhaps thinking of it as absolute evil is a little bit strange on the part of Americans, because in a way, Ukrainian lives depend on the outcome of the US election more than, say, my life in New York.
Okay, well, a big decision for Americans then.
Right.
You wrote an essay not all that long ago for The New Yorker. I suspect some of you will have read it, some of you might have read about it. It prompted a bit of a reaction.
A bit. I broke the Hannah Arendt Prize.
Yeah, we want to get to that, because we're not the only country that sort of had an issue with you coming in. You addressed the topic of Holocaust memory. So let's just assume no one's read it. Just explain why you wrote it and what you were trying to lay out.
Okay, so 8,000 words in 2 minutes. So Holocaust memory is something that I've written about and thought about for many, many years. my poor child was dragged on 2 month-long tours of every Holocaust museum in Europe on 2 consecutive summers. I think this may have something to do with the therapy bills that I'm still paying, but it's something that my initial interest was in trying to understand how we could use memory in the Soviet Union, memory of horrific mass crimes, horrific atrocities, in order to build a future. So I wanted to look at Holocaust museums, and then it just became an obsession with Holocaust memory. So after October 7th, I was very sensitive to the way in which Holocaust memory was being wielded. And I wrote an essay, and the point of the essay came about 2/3 of the way in, sort of after I'd built a case for this wielding of Holocaust memory. That the point of the essay was to call Gaza, or to compare Gaza to a Jewish ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe. And the reason that I wanted to do that was because at one point I was talking to actually an Israeli friend, and this was like 2 or 3 days after October 7th, and we were talking about how Gaza is always referred to as an open-air prison. And I said, but why? Like, it's not an open-air prison, whatever that might be, in any meaningful way. There are no prison guards. There's no prison regime imposed from the outside. What it was at the time was a fenced-in, immiserated, small, extremely dense space where people lived under a tyranny, but not under a tyranny of the occupiers, but under a tyranny of a force enabled by the occupying power. And the occupying power imposed restrictions on what was going in and out of the place, and on restrictions on the freedom of movement. And I thought, well, that is most like a Jewish ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe. And the reason that I thought it was very important to make that comparison was not to be provocative, but to give us language for understanding what was starting to happen then. So the essay came out at the beginning of December of last year, when Israeli troops had basically reduced the inhabitable and inhabited area of Gaza by about half. And that, if any of you have studied the history of the Holocaust, is exactly how ghettos would get liquidated. Was that the inhabited and inhabitable area of there was military force and there was a lot of targeted killing, but there was this compression that would happen. And so I thought it was important to have the language to describe that. And of course, why is the language of the Holocaust so important to describing it? Was because the memory of the Holocaust was being used to justify what Israel was doing. And the reason that it got me into so much trouble is because you're not ever supposed to compare the Holocaust to anything.
So there's lots of parts to that I want to ask you about. And a reminder as well, we will take audience questions for the last sort of 15, 20 minutes or so. The microphones are down there, so we will invite you up to ask a question, please, not long statements. Masha, you said the intention was not to be provocative, but you must have known it would be.
Yes, and I also, I missed an important part of the essay. The essay also delved quite a bit into the German anti-Semitism bureaucracy, which is something that had fascinated me, and it was a good occasion to write about it because I had been awarded the Hannah Arendt Prize for Political Thinking, which is awarded in Germany, and like all these German prizes is funded by largely by the state and organized by the state. So anyway, and many people who had been suspected of anti-Semitism, many of them, possibly most of them, Jewish like me, had gotten into trouble with the German state, and prizes had been rescinded. So I thought, well, what a great occasion to write about this pattern and this anti-Semitism bureaucracy when I'm about to get the Hannah Arendt Prize, because I was notified that that had been awarded in August, and then the ceremony was in December. And I was in Germany reporting and joking around with my friends and saying that, well, they're going to take my prize away. And my friends were like, well, no, not the Hannah Arendt Prize, and not from you. But of course, they didn't, but they kind of did. The morning that I was supposed to fly to Germany, and yes, one of my kids said to me, you know, recently with you, it hasn't even been like things you do, it's just getting there, right? Yeah. So the morning I was supposed to fly to Germany, I got an email from one of the organizers saying, be prepared. That was the subject line. And the city and state of Bremen had pulled out of the prize, and then the foundation, the Heinrich Böll Foundation that funds the prize, had also pulled out of the prize. And then in the end, I did end up getting the prize, but not in the ceremony that I was supposed to. It was sort of a back alley ceremony. But the reason that I said that I broke the Hannah Arendt Prize is that it will not be awarded this year.
Okay.
Because they decided, and this is not a joke, they decided that they need to build up guards to prevent the awarding of this prize to anti-Semites like Masha Gessen.
Okay. So that's their wording?
Yes, okay. that was the media report on it. Yeah.
Right. So just explain what Germany has done, because what you're referring to, I think, is, I suppose, a framework that has been placed over time, and particularly in recent years, including legislatively,
yes,
on the way in which the Holocaust can be discussed,
right,
and particularly in the context of other contemporary events. What has Germany actually done?
Right. So it has less to do with how the Holocaust can be discussed and more to do with how Israel can be discussed. So Germany has adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is and the IHRA is I can't remember what it stands for.
It's in your essay. If
it's in my essay. I think
yeah.
it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. And this definition is very expansive. It was never meant, to their credit, it was never meant to be legislated. But it's been adopted very widely, not just by Germany, but by a number of European countries and by the United States. It's actually now part of it's adopted by the State Department. This is something that happened under Trump. And this definition basically equates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And then Germany, after adopting it, created a network of anti-Semitism commissars, who are, as far as I know, none of them Jewish, who police speech and police state funding to prevent any state funding going to anybody who can be perceived as anti-Semitic, using this definition which equates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism.
For some people, it seems very clear and obvious the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism or criticism of the State of Israel. For others, it's very difficult to distinguish. What's your view? Is there a line to be drawn? You must understand why for some people they're completely connected and tied.
I think it's actually pretty anti-Semitic to equate anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. Not all Jews live in Israel. Not all Jews support the state of Israel. A lot of Jews who do live in Israel do not support the policies of their government. And so to completely equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism is also to equate all Jews with Israeli government policies. And that, I think, is anti-Semitic. And some criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. I think we're capable of recognizing it. And in fact, there are other definitions of anti-Semitism. There's a thing called the Jerusalem Declaration, which was created by, I think, something like 300 scholars of Judaic and Holocaust studies, which is incredibly thoughtful and possible to apply, and it makes it much easier to distinguish between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism.
Is it your sense that it is becoming harder to distinguish?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that it's becoming harder to distinguish. I think that there are a lot of people who are very invested in conflating these two things, anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. And I think that some of them are driven by a political agenda and some of them are driven by an anti-Semitic agenda.
And so, in terms of what it is that you wrote and the the parallels you drew, what in your mind is the value of drawing those connections?
Well, after World War II, we, and I say this expansively, we, humanity, said never again. We created an understanding of the concept of genocide and international laws against genocide. In order to, and genocide was something that grew directly out of our understanding of what happened during World War II and during the Holocaust. And so if we're going to apply those laws, if we're going to make good on the promise of never again, we actually have to continuously ask ourselves, is this like what happened during the Holocaust? Is this the thing that we promised would never happen again? Is this genocide, which is banned by international law? As you I'm sure know, there are people and countries that have asked this question. South Africa asked this question of the International Court of Justice, and we don't have a final ruling on that, but that was an extraordinary set of proceedings in which basically the South African side spent a day testifying, and they had 6 lawyers who laid out the case for how what's happening in Gaza is in substantive and very significant ways, like what happened during World War II, like the thing that is banned by the Genocide Convention. And then 6 Israeli and British lawyers representing Israel basically spent 3 hours laughing, mocking this idea that this comparison could even be made. And that, I think, runs morally and abhorrently counter to the spirit of the Genocide Convention. You can't laugh it off. You have to engage with this question and with this argument in the most earnest way possible. And then there's another case that was heard in a U.S. federal court that was brought by an American organization against the Biden administration, trying to halt military aid to Israel under the Genocide Convention, because the Genocide Convention bans not only genocide as such, but also any aid to a power that is carrying out genocide. And the proceedings were extraordinary to watch. I covered them as well, and there was one of the lawyers representing the organization that brought the suit said, "But Your Honor, you're saying that there's no remedy. That cannot be the case." But that did appear to be the case, or at least certainly there was no remedy in federal court.
Of course, an argument that's also made is that these terms are used too freely, too widely, that there needs to be a great degree of sensitivity around their use in honour of those that fell victim to the Holocaust.
Sure, that's all true. We can throw them around when we throw words around meaninglessly, when we don't interrogate how we use language. We make words mean nothing.
And do you think that these particular terms are used too freely?
I'm not aware of the word genocide being used too freely. I think that we sometimes use the word fascism and fascist too freely. But no, I'd be interested to hear if somebody has an argument about genocide, but I haven't seen that.
And so, beyond the specifics of your trip to, or your intended trip to Germany, what has been the response to this?
Well, I've been called a self-hating Jew, an anti-Semite. I think I lost some friends, but that's right. I mean, since then I've also been called a genocide enabler by.
What was that? I missed.
I was called a genocide enabler.
Okay.
For writing about Hamas sexual violence on October 7th. And just to prevent any kind of misunderstanding, I do not actually think that it's always, when you're being criticized by both sides, it's always a sign that you're doing something right. I think you can also just be fucking up on both sides. But I'm fairly sure that I've been doing okay with my coverage of Israel-Palestine.
Have you found yourself in circumstances where people are offended by it but do want to talk to you about it? I guess we're probably all here because we're interested in dialogue, at least, some kind of civic discourse, and clearly these are complex issues and complex interpretations of issues that you're grappling with. Just wondering if you've had instances where it has led to very thoughtful, layered conversation.
Not a whole lot.
Okay.
These, as I'm sure you're aware, are not subjects that people tend to have a lot of openness on. But I also think that when you write a very long essay like that, you kind of figure it's going to have a shelf life. And I think that even now, 6 months after it was published, it sounds much less shocking. It sounds like something that a lot of people will still object to, but at least they know it's possible, right? There are people who believe that it is essential to make this comparison, and to ask the question of whether that's what we're seeing. So in that sense, I think it's been constructive to a kind of larger conversation that I'm not necessarily a direct participant in. But no, it has not led to a lot of direct dialogue.
Something that struck me in reading the essay, but also then a lot of the coverage subsequent, and I know this when we spoke to you on the ABC the other day, I think you were referencing the intense focus that there's been on the use of the word ghetto and the way that's been, it's kind of overtaken the conversation. I just wonder if you have an observation on whether part of the difficulty or challenge, or maybe some of the reasons why people don't like to use this particular language, is that once you use it, then for many people the interpretation will be that you're saying the whole thing is the same.
Right.
Because in a sense, I guess that's part of what the reaction is, even though in the essay I don't think you're saying it's exactly the same.
Well, in fact, ghettos were not the same. There are many different ghettos, Jewish ghettos in Nazi-occupied Europe. And I can always tell when somebody hasn't read the essay but wants to scream at me because they accuse me of comparing Gaza to the Warsaw Ghetto. I didn't. I wrote that it's like a Jewish ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe. In fact, there are many different ghettos. There were open ghettos, semi-open ghettos, completely closed ghettos, like the Warsaw Ghetto. There are ghettos that had meaningful self-rule, and there were ghettos that were tyrannies. And so the whole thing cannot be the same because the thing is actually layered and complicated. But I think maybe the other thing that you're getting at is what the philosopher Zygmunt Bauman wrote about in his brilliant book, Modernity and the Holocaust. which was that the Holocaust was simultaneously an unprecedented, unique, a thing apart kind of event in human history, and a function of modernity, and something that, once it happened, remained something that humanity is capable of. And we have to hold these two thoughts in our minds at the same time, not in that totalitarian way that I talked about, where they don't cross, but where we actually fully engage with this contradiction of this is unthinkable and yet it happened, and it means it can happen again.
So very shortly we'll get to some of your questions. If you do have one, please take your position by one of the microphones. I just wonder if we can maybe tie something of a thread through this conversation and just circle back to the idea of misinformation, because it strikes me that you're making a case here for challenging narratives, but I suppose we all do live in a world where somehow fact has ended up on a level playing field a lot of the time with bullshit. So how do we navigate trying to re-examine events past and present and come at them from different angles?
I'm glad you asked a very simple question that I can answer. There are many different responses to that question, but maybe the most important one to me is we really have to think about how we do journalism and how we organize media. We cannot continue entrusting the public square to profit-making corporations. That's what creates that.
When you say that, are you talking about tech giants or media companies?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah.
You do work for the New York Times.
I do work for the New York Times, but I live in a country where there's basically no public media.
Okay. And why are you saying this? Yeah, I mean, we have a public broadcaster. I have to admit, I work for it. But just putting that aside, like, why? What are you saying is so critical?
Well, the interests of profit-making corporations are different than the interests of media consumers and media creators. Right? The profit-making corporation does not a priori have an interest in distributing the most accurate and fullest information to the largest number of people. It has an interest in clicks, in eyeballs, in advertiser dollars. For some periods of time in some countries, those interests happen to coincide. Right? It so happened that when small American towns and large American cities had such where businesses in those towns and cities and individuals had an interest in conveying commercial information, and so they needed to fill a lot of pages with things that commercial information could accompany. For a minute, those things coincided, but there's nothing that a priori unites them. And we don't ask the Senate to rent out space in the Capitol building in order to fund its proceedings. That would be kind of crazy. We collect taxes and pay salaries and enable people to fully engage with their public duty, but we do not think that way about public information.
Okay. Let's take some questions. There's a lot of you lined up, so please keep them brief. And I might just cycle through a few questions before we turn to Masha. So what's your question?
I've asked a lot of people I know about why America and Australia as governments are so willing to go along with Israel. And I receive ideas like it's their technology on surveillance, etc. Their countries are dependent, it's the money. But why do you think American and Australian governments are still going along with the wars?
Thank you very much for the question. We'll take another couple before we turn to Masha. What's your question?
Sure. Hello, Masha. Thank you for your work. What are intellectual or any other political responsibilities of Russian-born migrants, asking for a friend, if they if they want to keep fighting for Russian democracy and Russian dignity after what this country has done and has been doing to Ukraine?
Okay, let's answer.
I don't know that we have an obligation to the world because of an accident of birth. A lot of my friends and I have been engaged in a lot of soul searching over the last 2.5 years about, what did we fail, where did we fail, how did we not do enough? And obviously we didn't do enough because the war happened, and it keeps happening. And yet, I was talking to my best friend recently, and she has been working on this project with a lot of people who are exiles from other countries, and she said, it's amazing. Like the guy from Afghanistan that I work with, he doesn't seem to think that the rest of the world sees him as a representative of the Taliban. Like, why do we feel like the rest of the world? Why do we enable other people to see us as representatives of the Putin regime? And I think she's right. I think that I value responsibility to humanity based on where you are and what you can do, much more than I value responsibility based on where you had the bad luck to be born. And I think that is much more sort of uplifting and constructive than beating ourselves up. And also I think there's a degree of solipsism that happens when Russians wallow in how horrible we've been and how badly we have failed. Like, go volunteer in a soup kitchen, and that will benefit somebody somewhere.
No wallowing here.
Right.
Thank you for the question. And the previous question was about Western backing for Israel. I guess it's not new, but maybe we are hearing, at least rhetorically, some nuance in these positions.
I think it is shifting, and I think it's shifting very slowly. And there are obviously some very stubborn structures of thought, certainly in Washington, where I've heard people talk about how because support for Israel is a kind of axiomatic part of the Washington establishment, whether you're on the Democratic side or the Republican side, what the Republican side used to be before the Trump takeover of the Republican Party. It's kind of, you get to Washington, you have to assume that you have to adopt that set of assumptions because you won't get anywhere with any other set, and that is just an incredibly difficult and stubborn set of ideas to break through. It's not unique, perhaps, to support for Israel. There are other similarly stubborn structures of thought in American politics. And of course, that also has to do with the memory of the Holocaust. It has to do with how Western countries, including the United States, including Australia, failed to do enough to save Jews during World War II. And so this idea that they had to support Israel in order to make up for that catastrophic failure, and also in order to keep the displaced Jews of Europe from coming to their countries, I think that's part of what fuels that stubbornness.
That's how some interpret Trump's positions on Israel at various times.
Sure, yeah, you can hear that in what he said.
So let's take a couple of questions from here again. Please keep them brief.
Masha, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Masha, you began your article saying that Berlin never stops reminding you what happened there. You later went on to talk about how the many memorials also started to feel static and dogmatic Is it possible to build sites of memories that don't feel that way? And if so, what would they look like or feel like?
Okay, let's deal with that first.
That's such a great question. I think so. I think it's possible to build living memorials, and that's a concept, a living memorial. My favorite, as I mentioned, I've been to pretty much every Holocaust museum in Europe. So my favorite Holocaust museum is one in the small town of Lublin, which I think not coincidentally was created by a bunch of theater people, and it's a low budget, small museum. I don't know, it's 3 or 4 rooms, but it has ways of engaging with memory that, rather than putting it behind glass, just to be looked at. I'll give just one example. There's a room, so there are 300,000 Jews in Lublin before the Holocaust, and something like a dozen after. And so they created a room where they put 300,000 folders on the shelves. And very slowly and painstakingly, they're filling in whatever information they can get about people who lived in Lublin. But you never know when you take a folder off the shelf whether there's going to be a whole text in there, one piece of paper, somebody's name, or nothing. And that's such a beautiful example of, like, you put a person in a room and they're interacting with these folders and interacting with human lives and the traces that they leave and also don't leave.
Thank you. And so there was a question there about Putin's signature on a peace treaty, which does feel a little far away at the moment. But, I mean, is there a point that you imagine some kind of realistically a negotiation for some kind of settlement between Russia and Ukraine?
That's a really hard question to answer because we know that's the only way that wars end, right? They end in negotiation. We also know that for a long time Russia just wouldn't sit down, and now they've indicated that they might sit down, but Putin has issued an ultimatum that would give him more territory than Russia has already occupied. That creates an impossible situation for Ukraine. It was impossible already, even if the assumption were that they would be negotiating for already occupied territory. But imagine knowing what we know about what Russian occupation means. How can any Ukrainian leader say, here, take these people, take 1 million more to torture and to kill?
Putin has been okay with frozen conflicts.
Exactly.
So
he has zero interest in negotiating. Like, something would really have to shift. He would have to be brought to his knees on the battlefield for him to actually want to negotiate. So at this point, the point of any kind of negotiation is, and also we know that Putin is a completely unreliable negotiation partner. So what Ukraine is being offered is this, hand over people to be tortured and killed, and wait for Russia to regroup and attack again. That's what a peace treaty, if it were magically to happen in the current situation, that's what it would mean.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions, please.
Welcome, Masha. My question is around the idea of parallels, particularly within Australia. There's been a great disparity between the amount of people, or the amount of refugees from Israel, around 100%, as opposed of refugees being welcomed into Australia, as opposed to roughly 30% of Gazans being welcomed into Australia, with the alternative Prime Minister saying no Gazan refugees at all. Could you possibly see a parallel between that and what happened with Jewish refugees in the late 30s after Kristallnacht and other pogroms at the time?
Okay, and the lady behind, what's your question?
I was actually in that Lublin Museum last month. It's funded by the Lublin municipality. Incredible. And I would love to talk to you about that afterwards. My question to you is, how would you interpret the mutual empathy and solidarity between Jewish and Ukrainian communities here in Australia in particular? That's one question. I'd also like to just challenge one thing you said about the ICJ proceedings, which I did watch.
Keep it brief, because we're going to get to more questions.
The lead Israeli counsel, Tal Becker, actually spoke in New York. I'm sorry you weren't there. I watched it on Zoom, and he said that, far from laughing during that counsel, he cried. He cried at the moral inversion that forced him to actually stand in that space. So thank you. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you very much. And one more question.
Thank you for the talk. In your extensive experience in writing about Russian culture and Russian politics in English, what do you find the most difficult aspect of it to put into words? And another quick one, why do you think Russian anti-war journalism is overwhelmingly either implicitly or explicitly pro-Israel and anti-Gaza?
Okay, well, I think we've got about 7 questions there and we've got 2 minutes left. So let's just maybe cherry pick. So there's a question there about the parallels between refugees in Ukraine and I think from Gaza. So if you could just address that maybe.
I mean, it's not a revelation, unfortunately, to anybody just how racist first world asylum and refugee policies are. But if I can plug one thing, I'd say go find a way to watch Agnieszka Holland's film Green Border, which is an absolutely extraordinary dramatization of what's been happening on the Polish border with Belarus, where Russia and Belarus have been enticing Muslim refugees to come to Russia and Belarus, and then have been shoving them through the border into Poland with the express intent of destabilizing the European Union by sending these people there. I mean, it's just the cynicism and racism of this assumption is unbelievable. And then Poland tries to push them back. These people are being bounced back and forth between these countries. And the reason I mention it is that at the end, Holland points out that after about a year and a half of this, Poland accepted several million Ukrainian refugees easily and with open arms. And it's been an extraordinary feat of humanity, I think, for Poland to accept these Ukrainian refugees. But it's also been an extraordinarily racist and inhuman pattern. Wait, there was a Russian question that I wanted to get to, but what was it?
To be honest, I think there were too many questions and I didn't capture them all, but we are out of time. We're in the red. Would you please put your hands together for Masha Gessen?
Thank you. Thank you.
This session was recorded live at Carriageworks Sydney in August 2024. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a not-for-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit ethics.org.au to find out more. Thank you.